and related social sciences, organized by Jadavpur Association of International Relations. I'm Kaushiki Chatterjee, student of Jadavpur University's Department of International Relations. Today's session focuses on security studies. We are really happy and grateful to have Professor Aninda Jati Majumdar with us. Dr. Aninda Jati Majumdar did his graduation from Presidency College, Kolkata, and earned his postgraduate and PhD degrees from the School of International Studies, Jawaharlal Nehru University, where he specialized in Department of International Relations and is currently a research consultant with the Indian Council for Research on International Economic Relations and at present is an independent international group professor of strategic studies at the Department of International Relations, Jadavpur University. Former director of the School of International Relations and Strategic Studies at the Jadavpur University and former head of the department, Dr. Majumdar was also a visiting professor at the Richard Walker Institute of International and Area Studies of the University of South Carolina, USA, under the Fulbright Nehru Academy and Professional Excellence Fellowship Program. He has attended a number of national and international schedules at home and abroad and contributed research papers to journals and compendiums. Former editor of the Jadavpur Journal of International Relations, a SAGE publication, he has also authored and edited books on foreign policy, security studies, forced migration, and international relations. His latest co-edited books include Conflicting Identities, Travels of Regionalism in Asia, and Peace and Conflict Studies, Perspectives from South Asia. Without further delay, we should start the session, and now it's over to you, sir.
Thank you, Kaushiki. Thank you for that generous introduction. Well, I still consider myself as a student of international politics and security studies. So my observations are still, in fact, evolving. And good evening to all the participants. Uh, I apologize because I have developed a snag with my device, and therefore you can hear my voice. Probably you won't be able to see me because the camera is malfunctioning right at this point. And secondly, I don't have the, kind of PPTs or kind of PowerPoint presentation. So it would be a kind of monologue, a lecture for some considerable period of time, and then probably if you are interested we might indulge in some kind of question answer, or I would also like to hear your comments with regard to your own experience in terms of research. Now basically I have been asked to speak on security studies, and as I see from the schedule, you have already experienced a few lectures on research methods. So what I plan to do essentially is not merely we'll be talking about security studies, but also the popular methods that are applied in order to, kind of arrive at important research outcomes. So in a way, this lecture might seem as a kind of practical guide to research on security studies. And security these days, obviously, has become a kind of way of life. So all kinds of security issues that we see around us. But the kind of lecture that I am proposing, in fact, right at this point of time, would have essentially two parts. In the first part, I will talk about security, and please bear with me if you think that all these have already been discussed at some place or the other, or you are very familiar with these ideas. And then we will talk about one or two methods that are usually applied. That is, from my experience, I have found that certain methods are popular and certain methods are actually in fact applied because you need to complete the research, and you don't really want to stuck to some kind of research method that sounds very nice and ambitious and philosophically gratifying, but creating problems in path of actually completing your thesis or completing your research. Now, basically, the first part, when we talk about security, and let me just confess that there are different definitions of security, of course. But as you go deeper and deeper, you'd find that it is very difficult to define what security is. Now, you can have one dictionary kind of meaning of security, and that says freedom from risk, threats, and danger. Now, does it mean lack of threat in a given situation? In fact, does it mean some kind of a comfort zone? Uh, you know, can you achieve a state of being where there is no threat, no danger, no risk? Is such a state attainable? No, security in this sense you'd find is very elusive. That is, you hardly achieve the state of security, any kind of situation that is free from risk, danger, or threats. And even if you uh, reach, for argument's sake, a state of being where you are free from risk and danger, but then you might become paranoid. Paranoid in the sense that how to maintain that state of being, how to counter the challenges to that particular state of being. So therefore, I might say that security also includes some kind of a psychological element. That if you think about yourself, if you consider yourself, if you perceive yourself to be safe, perceive yourself to be secured, only then security means something to you. Otherwise, whosoever says about your security that you are safe, you are secured, etc., etc., unless you feel security, feel yourself as safe and secured, then of course you'd not be very convinced about that, that you have achieved some form of security. So usually the idea is that when we talk about security mostly, we actually get enmeshed in some kind of insecurity discourse, that we often talk about not security per se, but we talk about all kinds of insecurity situations. So that is all kinds of threats, risks, and dangers, and obviously some people would consider that as the reflection of the real world. Now, security, therefore, I have already mentioned that is why that it is pretty difficult, to understand what security is. Now, you can think of a matrix of very complex relations among actors, where challenges from the environment come in successive waves, or threats emanate from the very nature of relationships among the actors, creating and reinforcing an environment which might require constant management, reduction and elimination of certain challenges and threats by applying special skills and capabilities. So it's a kind of, not really, let's say, something to achieve. It's a kind of process where you'd find that it's very complicated, very complex, and the environment is such that you'd always find some kind of challenge emanating either from the environment itself, or the very nature of relationships among the actors, and therefore you constantly have to manage, nurture, what is good, and you have to reduce or eliminate the challenges and threats that are actually uh, destined to adversely affect your advantages. So you are looking for some kind of advantageous edge with regard to these kind of challenges. So in this sense, it would appear that uh, there would be challenges, but constant response and application of skills can perhaps take care of such challenges, and that would give, or might give, a feeling of security, that you are able to constantly respond through application of whatever abilities you have, your skills, and you are constantly responding to such challenges, and you can perhaps take care of many of these challenges, and that would generate some kind of confidence and would give you some feeling of security. So for me, really, in fact, when we talk about security studies, uh, from my experience, whatever I have, in this type of studies, I see that security is a kind of, you know, as I have just mentioned, is a kind of process. And we are always involved in this kind of process, always responding to challenges, hardly having a situation that is actually secured or that is actually free from risk and danger. Now, once we have this kind of, process that is always being evolved, always changing, always in some kind of flux, and sometimes we obviously have some, kind of situation where you might find stability, if not peace, basically some kind of stability. But then you can think of some kind of secured situation. But then you would always find some kind of paradox that in that secured situation, you might find some, some kinds of threats and dangers existing at the subtactical level. That is not apparently uh, dominant in day-to-day international politics, but obviously there will be all kinds of evolving trends. And unless you take appropriate measures to respond to those kinds of trends, these trends can transform themselves into threats and challenges. And once again, the situation is disturbed. The security of whatever, of a particular actor or the actors involved in a particular mechanism, particular arrangement would be disturbed, would be challenged. So basically, since it is difficult to understand and we are actually involved in some kind of insecurity discourse, researching on these particular areas also would require, some kind of special care. Now, much has been said about conventional, traditional, national security on the one hand, or individual centric human security on the other, or for that matter, a distinction is made between traditional security or non traditional security. We are familiar with those ideas. Now, great games of, let's say, power politics uh, are still continuing. Some people would argue it's irrelevant today. Security is enmeshed in everyday life of the common people now. And if you neglect human security, then this negligence would undermine the state. That is uh, the scale of such problems, so like food, water, shelter, healthcare, might threaten economic, social, or political, kind of fabric of the society, of the state, and could lead to some kind of collapse. So that is basic idea, that when we talk about security of the state or security of the individual, and essentially we find different aspects, different components of security, and obviously you just cannot think of some kind of a whole that would combine all these aspects. And of course, if we think of national security, then state remains the primary agency, and in fact, state remains the best agency to ensure human security as well. That is, security must be therefore viewed in its prismatic elements. All categorizations help academic analysis, but hardly supersede one another. So at different points of time, first thing is that since it's a process, at different points of time, different issues would become actually important. And these different challenges are to be obviously responded in different ways. And in fact, then you have all these problems with regard to traditional security, non-traditional security, and security perceived in military terms, security perceived in non-military terms. And you'd find that if you neglect one aspect of security, that is one component of security, then in fact you really cannot have security as a whole. You cannot ensure security, in fact, in other areas as well. And in fact, when you talk about in these days, you are familiar perhaps with the idea of securitization. And this securitization obviously is a very stronger form of politicization, and security issues are naturally politicized. And if priorities are to be determined and actions are to be taken on particular aspects, then obviously there has to be some form of securitization. And securitization doesn't mean that you have a new set of security issues coming up. The basic idea is to prioritize certain areas for certain states in a particular given situation. So therefore, not all issues would be kind of equally important for all these states. So different states with different capabilities, different kind of challenges, they might have unique sets of challenges. And for certain countries, certain kinds of threats could be very important, existential kind of threat. And for certain countries, certain other issues could be uh, important, could be other issues, security issues would be uh, kind of crucial to respond to. So, in a way, in this very process, you'd find different actors involved and at different points of time. In fact, we might talk about something like, time, space, and actor dimensions when we study these security issues. That is, if you think of a particular time at different points of time, you have different kinds of, let's say, for very for simplifying things, that you have, if you have different arrangements of the world order, that you have this bipolar world order during the Cold War period. That was at a particular point of time, you have a particular arrangement, a particular perception about the world. And then you have the post-Cold War world, where you are actually uh, trying to find out whether it's a unipolar world or a multipolar world, or actually a kind of oligopolar world, not really multipolar. But the idea is that you might come up with this compromise that it's a unipolar world with multipolar tendencies. Or if you try to see the new world order, every construction of such world order, or what I might call narrative here, you would find that you know the very nature of security issues changing, in fact, and there is no common very crucial security issues to all the countries at one given point of time. So time is important. During the post-Cold War world, we have all kinds of security issues that have come up. And then if you think of particular actors, the actors are involved in such a way that, the security challenge to a particular actor differs from the security challenge to another actor. And a space in the sense that, we have different areas, different regions with different geographical characteristics. Some, areas become important at a particular point of time. Some other areas become important at a different point of time. And this space, or say geographical areas, they become very crucial and important even if you formulate a particular type of a policy. So if you remember, Barack Obama at one point of time talked about APPAC region. So this APPAC region is a kind of construction where a particular space becomes important because of a particular policy, that was the US policy on war on terror. So naturally, you'd find that there are no common threats. All right. We can talk about certain common threats. So that is okay. Nuclear weapons are a threat to human civilization. Climate change is a threat to all countries. Likewise, pandemic, likewise, migration from one particular part to another part, even poverty, even certain such social and economic ills, they are also regarded as threats. So you might be familiar with this, very idea of securitization from Busan and Ole Weaver of, say, Copenhagen School. But even if you look into their ideas, so they are not really monolithic. They have, there are different kinds of views. And then if you consider security, uh, in fact, the another branch, that is critical security, towards human emancipation, that is of, say, Ken Booth or White Jones. These are called the Frankfurt School. So they have deepened the meaning of security, and Barry Buzan and, Ole Weaver, and the Copenhagen School as such, they have broadened the idea of security. So once again, the basic, point is that you reach a situation when you have this kind of process that is taking place all the time. And in fact, here, in fact, uh, all kinds of explanations that have been given so far, right from the realists, or the structural realists, the offensive realists, etc., to this kind of ideas of securitization, or even critical security towards human emancipation. It All these have contributed to some kind of amorphous area, a field where you have different trends, different kinds of challenges, different kinds of threats to different actors. And as a result of that, many of these things remain disparate, and it becomes very difficult to bring all those together into one, in fact, kind of within a kind of, let's say, context bound generalizations, and thereby making a meaningful contribution to the field of knowledge. So basically, what I am saying with regard to security, the idea is that it is somewhat difficult, in fact, to pursue a meaningful research on security studies, and most of the time it remains limited and lopsided. But nevertheless, of course, uh, in fact, we have to try, and we have to make certain generalizations. We have to learn, we have to analyze, we have to kind of explain various aspects of, kind of this security kind of challenges that we usually face. And we try to go for our own kind of research. And as you know, our research method is a well organized, systematic way, or a procedure to accomplish research. And this is finding out this well organized, systematic way or procedure that is best suitable to, understand security challenges, or explain some kind of security threats, or make some kind of policy prescriptions, what should be done, etc. It is really not an easy task. So it always kind of sounds very uh, let's say, attractive, ambitious, that you'd pursue research on security studies. So whatever security it is, that is, it is not merely a question of the security of the state like India, China, India, Pakistan, Indo-Pacific, etc., or the threats in the Indian Ocean region, what kind of uh, power equations would take place in this kind of region. But if you think of all other kinds of security, economic security, societal security, environmental security, human security, and as I have mentioned probably at the very beginning, that security thereby becomes a way of life. And actually we are dealing with insecurity issues and not really security issues. Now, nevertheless, the idea is, when we you know, kind of try to study, uh, in fact, a particular security issue, because when what counts as security issue, that is securitized, is a result of political and social discourse, and you find that something that is the issue of the day. For example, most of the students would now like to work on the Indo-Pacific. or say India's security policy in the Indian Ocean region, or for that matter, China's rise and the response of India, or for that matter, Quad in the Indo Pacific region. Now, you find sometimes that there are certain issues that are dominating the discussions, let's say in social media, dominating the discussions, or you'd find that most of the literature or most of the articles that are being published or in the newspaper, these kinds of issues are being discussed, and you get the opinion of different experts, and generally thereby you are sucked into this discussion. That means your thinking is very much influenced by what is happening around you, and therefore your tendency would be to select a topic that you would say very relevant, very topical, very meaningful, and you'd just get into it without thinking much about it. Okay, I am just in fact trying to you know uh, provide some kind of practical explanation of the problems with regard to research and choosing an appropriate method to perform research. And here obviously I am using security studies simply to explain the problems. And even if you think of this kind of in that you'd uh, in fact work on some kind of security issue, uh, essentially the idea is you should deal with hard facts. But hard facts are not always available. And there are various, I would rather say, play of perceptions that we intuitively kind of perceive something. That perception could be misperception as well. And we actually engage in building narratives. And mostly in international politics, increasingly you would find that we are dealing with narratives and not really policies and not really with hard facts, though there are attempts to in fact, we might say sample collecting in that sense, or collecting data. You are looking for hard facts, and if hard facts are not really available, in fact you'd look for other kinds of facts, let's say, if not from the primary sources, from the secondary sources and things like that. But usually, in most cases, the tendency is to in fact get embroiled into geopolitical narratives, because narratives are something, these are stories have perennial appeal, in fact, and geopolitical narratives emerge because of the attempts to understand, explain, theorize, and interpret the interplay of, as I was just referring to, the time, space, and actor dimensions of international relations. And a narrative is, or can be defined as a way of establishing interlinkages among events in order to present a kind of unique account that is attractive, easy to understand, and they often invoke emotional attachment. In fact, the basic idea is that you'd if you work on hard facts, often you'd find that it is not really easy to collect hard facts. More, kind of easily available are the views or the opinions or perceptions, and then you'd find that you are actually building up a story and trying to sell that particular story as research outcome. Now let me just give you some example. Uh, a particular narrative obviously would focus on particular space, particular time, particular actors. Now think of something like, say, uh, some of the very popular phrases that we have come across in recent times in international politics. For example, war on terror. What it really means. In fact, it is some kind of a narrative, and this narrative might have certain common elements, but whose war and against whom, uh, you need to have those specific parts. So different countries have their own wars on terror. US in a particular way, Russia in a particular way, China in a particular way, India in a particular way, and war on terror actually provides you with some kind of narrative, and nothing more than that. And for example, if you talk about the new world order, you would remember that just after the end of Cold War, you know, the US came up with the idea of a new world order. In fact, President George Bush, the father of the President Bush, of who actually went for this war on terror, and at that particular point of time, the idea was to have a new world order, and this new world order would be based on liberal democratic principles, and obviously the West would lead that kind of a world, and then USA in turn would lead the West, and gradually, if you think of the idea of end of history, all right, uh, once again, very appealing, and it talks about a situation where there is no challenge to liberal democratic values. That is this Fukuyama's famous thesis. If you think of clash of civilizations, and once again you find, in fact, uh, attempts to build narratives that are very appealing, that are attractive, and very easy to understand, very kind of simple kind of analysis. And then of course with this you'd have some kind of emotional attachment involved. And even if you come to certain you know so-called strategies that we very often talk about. That is, for example, string of pearls strategy. Now, string of pearls essentially is a name that was given, in fact, by the Western, kind of interpreters to this Chinese policy, where China was viewed as developing ports around India, and that meant some kind of encirclement with India, encirclement of India. Now, there is no official Chinese policy like string of pearls, but string of pearls would indicate some kind of you know, behavior on part of China, and that suits with this assertive, aggressive positions of China in the contemporary period or rise of China. So you have, obviously a counter narrative, that is necklace of diamonds. Once again, no official strategy, but the idea is thereby you have some kind of, encirclement, greater encirclement of China. Now, if you think of, for that matter, wolf warrior diplomacy, or for that matter, rising China, with a sub story of emerging India, naturally you would find that these two countries are destined to clash at a particular point of time. So, policies that are formulated, they derive their sustenance from these narratives, and that is why my observation is that policies are cocooned within narratives, and it's very difficult when we talk about securities and research on security studies, what our actual purpose is and what we can actually do, because we need to find out that or need to make the distinction between uh, you know uh, this distinction between these narratives and actual policies, and what happens when these policies are actually executed on ground. So it actually, I am just giving an example of security studies of this play of perceptions and, in fact, these narratives, this kind of emotional attachment that evokes, these narratives evoking emotional attachment. All these things might create problems in conducting a meaningful research. All right. And therefore, in fact, that is from my experience, what I have guided a few, obviously, research thesis, and most of these theses had to do with various types of security issues, security problems. But very often, I found the tendency that people are more, kind of carried away by these narratives rather than focusing on hard facts. Now, when we deal with security, in fact, what would be the purpose of research? Okay, already, let me just say it's a very kind of complicated field. And if you think it's a kind of process, and where we are mostly talking about security, obviously the task is to respond to the challenges that are continuously emanating. And in fact, how do we respond to those, in fact, challenges all the time? So, you may try to explain certain trends, certain types of events, and your purpose would be some kind of theory building, that you come up with some kind of a theory that would more or less explain, though it will, I doubt whether it will be perfect, because no theory is perfect, in fact. And you have a theory, and human ingenuity is such that people might say, okay, uh, yes, the theory actually predicts this type of behavior, but let's try certain alternatives and let's see what kind of outcome people might have. So that is because of human ingenuity. People might not always follow what is prescribed by theory, but nevertheless you develop some kind of a theory, and that theory generally tends to explain the trends of affairs. That is one aspect that could be your purpose, and that helps to understand international politics. Not a complete understanding, but nevertheless, to a significant extent, one can understand what what are the trends and how one can explain such trends. Second aspect is to see what kind of lessons we can learn from certain events, past events or contemporary events. And in fact, you here the idea focuses not only to theorize, but to understand. And in fact, and interpret or explain, analyze, and thereby you actually come up with certain lessons that because of these things happened, and how these things happened, why these things happened, and out of this we can have certain lessons. Idea is that can you apply these lessons to a completely different situation. That is, suppose you learn about confidence building measures between country X and Y, and you say that, okay, X and Y have adopted this kind of reassuring measures. They had disputes between them, but by adopting this kind of measures, they have successfully, you know, reduced the elements of conflict in their relations. So, what were those confidence building measures? How these countries arrived at those confidence building measures? You learn certain lessons, and after learning these lessons, you can stop at that, no problem with that. But you can proceed further, and you can think of another kind of situation where, let's say, between country A and B, and you say that country A and B also has some kind of they have some kind of a dispute, and then you can apply the lessons that you have learned from country X and Y, and this could perhaps be applied in case of country A and B. Then what you are actually doing is you are presenting policy prescriptions. There obviously one part of it would be some kind of assessment of policy, and you say this policy is inadequate, obviously, otherwise you don't have to prescribe new policies, and then you can prescribe these policies on the basis of the lessons learned. Now, all these purposes, you can have different, purposes of your research, but as essentially, you would find under these three broad categories, what I would call, you say, theory building on one hand, or analytical explanation and lessons learned, that is another kind of category, and then policy assessment and prescriptions, so that is another kind of category. And obviously, when you prescribe, you know it's not just like what you feel. uh, I would obviously reject that kind of a thesis that talks about, for example, all kinds of problems between India and Pakistan, and then finally towards the end it would give certain prescriptions that would be dependent on change of heart of these two countries, so that if these two countries can go for more trade and cultural people to people contact and things like that, there is a possibility of peace. Fine, but the idea is then you'd have to find out whether there is some kind of actual scope of applicability of these kind of prescriptions, that you can very well say, okay, India and Pakistan, they should indulge in kind of cross-border trade, people to people contact, soft power can be used and things like that, but you have to take into consideration the challenges that are emanating from the environment itself. And so it might not be some kind of normal relations between the two countries, and just your prescriptions would simply, uh, it would be well meaning prescriptions, but your prescription might not work at all. So, more and more, you have to focus on, let's say, these hard facts as far as practicable, and try to reduce the possibilities of getting sucked into the play of perceptions or building narratives. And in fact, therefore, before you start actually working on security studies, certain questions are to be asked. And that will actually help you in narrowing down the context, where you are actually, you know, trying to have a go. That is, you trying to concentrate on particular, let's say, areas, on particular issues, and therefore certain questions can be asked. And now, David Baldwin, in fact, in his the concept of security, it came out in 1997 in Review of International Studies. There is one such article. He was talking actually about concept of security, but there he talked about certain questions in order to kind of analyze the very concept of security. But I find these questions very relevant in terms of going for a research on security studies. For example, when you are planning to do a research, first thing is, don't be very much influenced by the narratives. Okay. But then you are looking for the answers to particular questions. So ask these questions first, the basic conceptual questions that are essentially to be asked by the scholar first. When a scholar wants to work on, let's say, security issues or any kind of security issues, that is, first question is security for whom? And when you go by this particular question, that you have in mind, that whose security you are, in fact, concerned with. Now, accordingly, if you are, in fact, concerned with the security of uh, the state, or security of the individual, security of a community, security of a particular group, social group, economic group, linguistic, whatever, and accordingly, you'd find that your research areas, would start to, find a direction. And then, how much security? That is, what kind of security you are looking for. Then optimum security, that is freedom from risk and danger. We have obviously kind of mention that as something that is very difficult to achieve. A state of being is difficult to achieve, but how much security would actually satisfy, uh, you know, that particular group with whose security you are in the first place concerned with. And this security, that is the amount of security that you want to achieve, from what? That means you are then thinking in terms of the threats, that from what I would like to have that kind of security. And once it is decided from what you are planning to have that kind of security, then by what means? What means are, let's say, the instruments that you would apply, or the measures, the policies that are applied, and by what means this security is sought to be achieved. And then comes at what cost? Obviously, you know, a state's ability is limited, or for that matter, a group's ability is limited, and individual's ability is limited. So, if you want to pursue simultaneously all kinds of goals, it would not be possible. All right, that is, you are, at the same time, you are the let's say, economically the most powerful, militarily the most powerful. There is social harmony within your state, no conflicts within the state itself, no conflicts outside. You know, this kind of situation is more or less unthinkable. All right, uh, and obviously you have to make trade-offs. That you pursue one kind of security, then that would mean that would, prioritize some of the goals, and naturally some other goals would be would not get the same priority at that particular point of time. So you have to always make some kind of balance of, let's say, your priorities, and that means the kind of cost they are ready to pay with. And in fact, we would say, and for example, uh, if we once again just giving examples in simple terms. First, we asked this question: security for whom? Let's say security for India. In very simple terms, national security, state security. So we are not really talking about people. We are not talking about various groups, etc. We are not bringing those elements into our discussion, but we are actually focusing on India's security. And when we talk about, let's say, India's security, we can think in terms of, let's say, uh, you I would rather say three basic categories. That is, one is core territorial security, that is your territory, and then core interest security. Whatever is the interest of the state, it depends on obviously prioritization and securitization, etc. And then core value security, in the sense that your political beliefs and convictions, like democracy, rule of law, etc., etc. So this territorial security, interest security, all are, let's say, we are just talking about core territorial, core interest, core value security, and that would be India's security. India would like to achieve that kind of security. All right. How much security? Obviously, it obviously the idea is that you cannot really have your territorial security, economic security, value security, everything, at one go. So you'd have to make, certain uh, adjustments into that, whether you are focusing on territorial security or on your interest security, etc. And then from what? Let's simplify things. We are not making it, very tough. Let's say from China. That is because China is a kind of rising power. We do not have very good relations with China. We have this history of war with China. We have, kind of Galwan clash, border disputes, line of actual control, etc., etc., etc. So China is a kind of threat. By what means? Then, of course, you are thinking in terms of making yourself more powerful, mobilizing forces at the border. Uh, there could be other areas of conflict, say for that matter, Indian Ocean. So, would you like to have alliances? Would you like to have some kind of coalition with other like-minded countries? For example, just for argument's sake, Quad, though Quad is not a military alliance, and obviously India has some problems with regard to military alliances, but there could be various measures. There could be, subjugation, that okay, you accept that China is a very powerful state, and you remain subservient to China, or you challenge China and obviously the kind of policy that you choose would have different kinds of outcomes, different kinds of impact, different kinds of repercussions. At what cost? So these are again, at what cost means what kind of, let's say, financial liability you might have. If you form some kind of military alliance, say with the United States, will you become a junior partner to the United States? Will you just compromise on your, India's precious idea of strategic autonomy or your sovereignty? And at what time period? That is also an important question. That is how much time you actually uh, are actually ready to spend on this particular aspect. Now, there are sometimes it is said, it would be 50 years, 100 years. China, for that matter, has a vision and it can wait for a long time, etc., etc. But all these questions are very important. At what time period? What is the priority security threat? And what is a short-term security threat? What is a long-term security threat? So when you actually discuss all these questions, you ask these questions, you would find a direction, in fact, with regard to the kind of topic you choose. That, whatever topic you choose, but if you ask these kind of questions, gradually you would see that, in fact, uh, your thesis is taking shape, or let's say the very proposal that you'd begin with is somehow taking shape to. There was some break. Sorry for the interruption. A phone call came, and you know, I think you can hear me clearly.
Yes, sir.
So, in fact, the most popular method is essentially desk chair analysis. All right, that is what I found. That is, you don't go anywhere. You just try to, in fact, follow the internet sources, liberally borrow from others, and use shortcuts. And in fact, the thesis actually shows and reflects the sincerity and genuineness of a researcher. When one goes through it, the examiner or the reader can easily make out, how sincere that, in fact, the researcher or the scholar is. And in fact, if one is motivated to earn a degree, as it is expected by the system, contemporary system, or whether one is actually motivated to make a meaningful contribution to the field of knowledge, becomes quite clear when one goes through this kind of thesis. All right. So, basic point is that you have come, you are experienced with a number of research methods, I believe, by now. There are two aspects that are mostly applied when, especially taking into consideration the kind of facilities we have, the kind of, uh, let's say, the environment, research environment that exists in this part of the world, I might say. You'd find two methods, and those I think have already been discussed. One is the case study method, and the other is what is called historical analytical method. These are two qualitative methods, obviously, and these two tools are actually applied very much. Now, let me just mention here that sometimes why people would talk about historical or descriptive analytical approach, because of problem of access. You want to work on terrorism, so what you try to do, it becomes difficult for a scholar to visit places where you have, let's say, uh, uh, acts of terrorism taking place frequently. But then I would, of course, suggest that there are a number of issues that can be selected, even if it's not security studies, even in other issues. That if you have some kind of problem that you adopt, some kind of challenge, some kind of issue that you adopt, you try to find that you have some available data on that aspect, or you can go at least to the field, you can talk to people, you can get their views, you can get some kind of primary source available on those particular aspects, and accordingly you uh, kind of indulge into your own research. So that is, you fence the milieu, you narrow it down. You might not be able to uh, cover all the aspects. You might not have the necessary training to do certain work, but as students of political science and international relations, we can always work on the political implications or significance or political interactions, etc. And our focus, I think, should be on that particular aspect, because we are trained in, let's say, political science, international relations, or some kind of social science. uh, you might have different kinds of training, and depending on your training, use your training so that when you are working, when you are doing your research, obviously that particular training helps you in 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 the progress of that kind of particular research. All right, so let us very briefly talk about uh, these two methods. How do we apply, in fact, with certain modifications, of course, how do we apply these methods? And I'm not really talking in terms of theoretically what are the benefits, what are the advantages and disadvantages, though I will refer to those, and how it actually affects this research and our kind of progress in our research. Now, obviously, when you go for a case study, that is, you select a case, and it could be select a single case study, it could be comparative case study, and when you try to build some kind of a theory, a comparative case study would suit you, and you kind of explore into different cases, and you analyze those cases, and then you find out certain general trends or generalizations. So, when case study method is applied, it means systematic analysis of cases in order to test your competing hypothesis, draw lessons of history, and generalize across cases to develop new theories. That you come up with some kind of basic, kind of observations. These observations should form some kind of theory that would explain uh, various events, various trends of events. But this would require, the basic idea is not really selecting a few cases, but you require some kind of, you have to attain high level of conceptual validity, basically. And in doing that, uh, it's the kind of, identify, you taste, you refine the various, the variables and your hypothesis, And as a result of that, basically it is argued, in fact, it is expected that you actually examine causal mechanisms of events. And through intensive examination, you actually thereby come uh, to certain explanations. So, and you say case one, case two, case three, and you would find certain common trends. And then those common trends you generalize, obviously, after thorough examination of these causal, mechanisms of events, the causal mechanism that what happens and why it happens, and then you come to some kind of general explanation. And for example, let's say we uh, would like to work on let's say leadership factor, that is how leadership influences uh, a kind of security issue. And here you can select a few cases, or you can select a single case. For example, we might say that you know towards the end of the Cold War period, when there was Reagan and Gorbachev, in fact in the late 1980s, you would say, INF treaty came into being, that Intermediate Range Nuclear Forces Treaty came into being in 1987 actually. And what role was played by Reagan and Gorbachev and their personal, kind of considerations. That means, uh, you know, we are actually shifting our focus from, let's say, the usual explanation that, okay, towards the end of the Cold War, Gorbachev actually came up with new kinds of policies. Situation of Soviet Union was bad, and Gorbachev wanted to change the situation. He wanted some kind of peace with the United States, etc., etc. So you can have these kind of explanations. But when the focus is on leadership, and the basic idea is how leadership actually works, how individual traits or individual beliefs and convictions, or what is called idiosyncratic peculiarities of a particular individual, how would this would work. Now if we say, for example, that both these leaders, both Gorbachev and Reagan, were hungry for publicity, positive publicity, you know, uh, or for that matter, both were uh, aware that they might make history, or for that matter, both faced trouble at home, and they wanted to have some kind of image engineering. Now we can go behind this. It's a kind of single case study that you are making, but your focus is on, let's say, leadership, and you are trying to, see what common traits, brought these two political leaders, these two leaders of two countries, to sign a treaty that actually made history. First, one might say, disarmament treaty that actually reduces nuclear weapons, or reduced nuclear weapons from in Europe, and eliminated certain types of nuclear weapons. Now, thereby, in fact, uh, this case study method, it works to a very significant extent well in security. There could be other methods as well, but generally, my experience is that students usually prefer this kind of methods, and obviously there would be some kind of problem, that why do I select, let's say, Reagan, Gorbachev, and the INF treaty? There could be a case selection bias, and that is one disadvantage in case study method. But all that case selection bias would always be there, and you know it is not determinate in selection of variables, what kind of variables you are adopting and actually why. I would say, given this example, that both these leaders were hungry for publicity. They were aware that they were making history. And why I, would select these kind of variables instead of other kinds of variables. All right. So essentially, you would find that when we select our variables, we actually move intuitively. And there are some, intuitive kind of moves that we make at the initial stage, and then when we move a little bit ahead, then we find that whether this particular variable that we have selected, this particular variable actually fits into the scheme of things or not. So, you know if it fits into the scheme of things, obviously it remains. If it doesn't fit, it goes out. And in fact, if you think of this kind of single case study method, there is a limited explanatory range compared to multiple case studies. That is, I say, only in case of INF treaty, if I come to some kind of observations, that Reagan and Gorbachev, and as political leaders, they played this kind of a role, and that is the kind of lesson that you are, kind of that you come across. But obviously, it will not allow you to build any kind of a theory or some kind of generalization across cases to develop a new theory. And in fact, here, thereby, if you select a single case study, there are certain limitations. But if you collect a kind of or select a kind of comparative case study in terms of, let's say, multiple cases, there are obviously, uh, problems. Once again, there could be a selection bias, and selection bias seems to be inescapable. All right, that is, you know, what is sensible under the circumstances is one, that you select cases that best serve the purpose of the inquiry. That what you have in mind, what you have the purpose, and you select the best cases. All right, and obviously select cases that maximize uh, the you know uh, the strength and number of tests for the theories and hypotheses. Whatever theory and hypothesis you have, or whatever kind of statement this you have already made, and you try to select cases so that it maximize the strength and number of tests. All right, but then again, there is a limit to it. I tell you that, suppose we are working on something like uh, another very popular kind of theme. Uh, it was very popular a few years ago. What is the role of coalition partners in Indian foreign policy? And 9 out of 10 would select cases, two cases basically. One would be of the role of the DMK in Tamil Nadu with regard to the Tamil problem with Sri Lanka, and the other would be this case of West Bengal with regard to river water sharing with Bangladesh. And then obviously you have two case studies, you compare the case studies, and then you come to certain generalization that, okay, the let's say, for argument's sake, basically, that the minor parties or these regional parties have actually influenced the policy making of the uh, you know uh, government at the center, and this was possible because it was a coalition government, and coalition government actually dependent on the support of the minor allies. All right, this is some kind of intuitive uh, kind of observation that we first make, and then by selecting these cases we make a general observation that look, yes, the in coalition governments, in fact, the minor parties, they influence policy decisions because the government is actually dependent on the support of these constituting parties. If you select many other cases, like PDP from Kashmir, the extent of their influence, or the left parties and the nuclear deal, what was the outcome of that? Then you would find, different kinds of outcomes, and all these would depend on how you have selected the cases. So, in fact, sometimes it is said that there could be arbitrary selections of cases. That is, you pick up, you know arbitrarily, a few cases, and then obviously the outcome would be uncertain. You would never know what kind of observation, what kind of conclusion you would reach. But that would be the kind of one kind of research where you would very well say, okay, uh, it might go this way, it might go that way. There is no fixed rule about it. You cannot generalize and cannot come to a set kind of conclusion. So here in this type of you know um, there are various processes. I might not go into it because uh, I think you must have already come across these processes, that you ask common set of questions that would be asked in each case. That is, you do not try to explain each case differently, and in fact, uh, if you go for the evolution, in fact, of a particular case, how the material and cognitive conditions actually shaped the evolution. And there, this is called process tracing, basically, to identify factors motivating and influencing decision makers, and what kind of factors motivating and influencing decisions makers were present in each case, so that you can obviously come to uh, you know some kind of generalization. So you can come up with uh, generalizations about principles and strategies of, well, let's say, crisis management. What kind of crisis management policies were adopted by a particular state in a particular situation? And, what are the experiences of these states? And what are the lessons that can be, once again, applicable to such future events? All right. So from the case studies, certain generalizations can always be made. Some people would say that it is not methodologically ideal, because you may require diverse approaches, including quantitative analysis and things like that. But essentially, you know, this is a popular method with the students, that you kind of have certain cases, select certain cases intuitively. And the basic idea is you try to select cases that best serve the purpose of the inquiry, but arbitrary selections can also be interesting. All right. And in fact, you know, uh, for example, this very good example is democratic peace theory. And you select a few cases, and then you go through those cases, you explore and analyze those cases, and then you come up with some kind of generalization that democracies that do not really fight war, they are more inclined to settle disputes through negotiation and things like that. But obviously there are many instances, in fact, where the situation, obviously, in fact, the outcome would be different if you select different other cases. For example, let's think of a situation that India was a democracy during the Cold War period. All right, Russia, a communist regime, authoritarian regime. USA was a democracy. Pakistan was under, say, military rule during 1971. But this US actually provided support to a military dictator and a country under military rule. And that actually went against interest of, the largest democracy of the world, that is India. And India establishes some kind of link with, an authoritarian state, so to say, with Soviet Union at that particular point of time. So how you select cases and then how you come to, in fact, a particular conclusion uh, is very crucial, is very important when you are going for case study method. And obviously people might say, okay, most of the cases actually prove the rule, and there are certain obviously exceptions or aberrations and things like that, but nevertheless, even if you cannot uh, derive a law like theory, but certain generalizations can always be made from this kind of case study methods. All right. So this is one aspect, and this is not very different. Some of its aspects are quite similar to the another, qualitative research, which is non-interactive document research, and very often these are called historical analytical research. And basically, এখানে here what we talk about is there are two parts. That is how an event occurred when you are describing a particular, once again, it could be a case, could be a particular event or certain events, and you form your research questions, but those would center around how an event occurred, which is the descriptive part, and why that particular event has occurred or happened. That is the interpretive part. All right. So once again, basically, you interpret facts to suggest causal explanations. And in this kind of historical analytical approach, basically, since it is essentially based on non-interactive document research, that you are not really involved in the setting. Uh, you know, you analyze, you describe and interpret and analyze the past or recent past from selected sources. It could be sources, could be the documents uh, preserved in all kinds of collections, or you can have participants, obviously, who might respond to your questionnaire, who might respond to your let's say you know interview, etc., etc., and there you are getting some kind of resources, once again, uh, oral testimonies, oral histories, along with the written documents that you have. Now, these written documents, as you know, could be published, unpublished letters, diaries, maps, autobiographies, articles in journals, newspapers, whatever. There is, and obviously, if you uh, you know uh, if you interview people, if you in fact kind of get or elicit response to certain specific questions from people, then obviously you get the resources, and you use the primary source, you use the secondary sources. uh, One particular aspect is very necessary. Now, whether you use primary sources, I am not making the distinction right now, and the secondary sources, both these types of sources are to be subjected to techniques of criticism to assess the authenticity and trustworthiness of the source. All right. So the idea is that anything that is printed, anything that is spoken on, let's say by whosoever, by politicians, by policymakers, by academicians, by experts. Many of the writings could be motivated writings. Okay, and when you are dealing with motivated writings, and remember, essentially those would be all kinds of narratives and things like that. It would become very difficult for you to come to certain verifiable, kind of, let's say, uh, conclusions. Obviously, verifiable in social science means something different from natural science, and you have to uh, apply all kinds of criticisms, essentially, on this particular sources to find out the authenticity and the exactness, the trustworthiness of a particular source. That is, you have to also, it's not merely quote from X, or X says this, or according to Y this, and then you say this actually means, whatever you say. But it is also important to know who wrote it, when, where, and for what audience or purpose. All right. That is, people have their own perceptions, people might have their own views, and they would try to uh, use those perceptions, those writings, those speeches, uh, and this could be to a particular audience that might not reflect the fact, or might not reflect the exact reality or the hard facts. So there is always this possibility that you can get into some kind of a problem, of getting into some kind of stories, some kind of narratives, and obviously, the basic task is to find out the facts, from archives, what has actually happened. And in fact, when you have a series of generalizations from facts, that would suggest a causal explanation for a specific event. And uh, in fact, that really requires another aspect. That is, a researcher has to clearly mention some kind of a theoretical foundation from which the interpretation is being made. That is, you make some kind of interpretation. Obviously, as a researcher, you might be a believer in, realist ideas. You might be a believer in, constructivist, feminist, Marxist, liberal. So a theoretical, whatever kind of ideas you might have, foundation is to be provided. It is not necessary for the thesis itself, for the research itself, but it is necessary, to understand your own inclination, that how you actually interpret one particular event or the hard facts. Now, if you are a liberal, you would interpret in a particular way. If you are a realist, you would interpret in a different way. So accordingly, it pays. In fact, it helps if you come up with some kind of theoretical, uh, kind of, uh, let's say, foundation at the very beginning of the thesis. So here in this historical analytical approach, you have, some kind of descriptive narration that actually provides in a chronological order, describes the event. All right. Then there would be interpretive analysis, that you interpret this event within a broader context. All right. That is, uh, why these things happened, what are the issues involved, what were the positions of the actors, and things like that. And you can also have some kind of comparative analysis. So you can compare similarities and differences of one event to other events, and thereby you achieve certain generalizations. And likewise, that you have some kind of theoretical foundation. That means that it talks about your own, theoretical inclination, and you also have a section where you should talk about the limitations. Limitations in the sense that you are working on some particular issue, but there is a limit to availability and accessibility of primary sources. This could be a limitation. uh, you know, lack of specialized training, that you cannot read some of the primary sources. Suppose you are working on China, you do not know Chinese. That is a lack of specialized training. Of course, you cannot access, in fact, some of the primary sources coming out of China. And actually, all studies have some limitations, but it helps if you actually talk about this criticism, and in fact, I mean, actually talk about these limitations, so that you can avoid undue criticism of your work. And therefore, essentially, when you write a research proposal, we ask, especially on security issues in particular, and in general, in whatever issue you are having in mind, always ask a few questions, you know, with regard to, for whom, from what, by what, in what ways. These are the questions that are to be applied in order to, narrow down the focus of your work. Then obviously you introduce a particular theme, and once you introduce a particular theme, you have to explain why that particular theme is meaningful. And then you look for the literature that are available. You know, uh, if there are sources exist and are available, and if you ignore that kind of source, and if you do not cover that kind of source, then it would be regarded as a serious flaw in the research. So, a bibliography is not just, some kind of list of books or journals or articles. It actually requires some kind of intense, let's say, uh, involvement with the work. If you want to, of course, want to make your work good. And once you go through the literature, then from the literature survey itself, you'd come to know about the research gap, that questions that would come up that you haven't got any answer, any response in whatever you have studied. And if you are going for these questions, in fact, in the form of hypothesis, in the form of research questions, then you go for the appropriate method that would be kind of uh, applied while you are going for research. Okay. And here, the basic idea is that if you want to do a good work, of course, there are many issues involved. Your method is important. A systemic method is important. And once you basically know about a particular research method, and a particular research method that you think is suitable for your study, you learn the process, you learn the methods, but more important would be the scale of intensity, how intense you are, how involved you are in pursuing your research by applying whatever kind of research method you want to have. And this intensity, as I have mentioned in the very beginning of this lecture, that this intensity actually shows in the substance of the thesis. And then you don't have to bother about what would be the fate of my thesis. You'd be confident enough that you have actually, if you are intense, if you are serious, that you have actually contributed to the field of knowledge. You have actually explained something, actually helped in understanding a particular type of event, or actually have learned lessons from uh, a particular kind of case study. All right. Uh, I think I would stop here. All right. So if you have questions or comments, I'll be glad to respond to. Thank you very much for your patience. I hope you are not sleeping at this point of time.
Yes, sir. Sir, may I speak?
Yes, sure.
Yes, so indeed it was a very insightful session. And just a small comment. I am doing my research on geopolitics of Indian and Chinese energy security strategies, a comparative analysis from 2001 to 2020. And I think the this session was particularly important for mine because then I got a clarity on case studies and many other things, such as the issue of generalization, the issue of limitations while collecting the primary data. So I and even like I am going to conduct some expert interviews over here. So I think there were many good points in your session that will be helpful for me. So thank you so much, sir. It was a very insightful session.
Okay, thank you very much. Thank you for your kind
Yes.
words.
Thank you, sir. Yes.
Thank you. Yes, please.
স্যার, আমরা জেনারেলি দেখতে পাই যে জিও পলিটিক্স খুব ডাইনামিক থাকে। তো
Hmm.
আমি হঠাৎ করে যদি কোনো একটা অবজারভেশন করি অ্যান্ড সেটা পেন ডাউন করতে গিয়ে দেখি যে রিয়েল মানে অন গ্রাউন্ড যে রিয়েলিটি সেগুলোই চেঞ্জ হয়ে গেছে। তো ঠিক এই অবজারভেশন অ্যান্ড মানে পেন ডাউনের মধ্যে যে দূরত্বটা থাকে স্যার, সেটাকে কিভাবে দূর করতে পারি স্যার?
দেখো, যখন কোনো একটা ইভলভিং ইস্যু নিয়ে কাজ করছো না, তখন চাও বা না চাও, ইউ বিকাম এ পার্ট অফ ইট। কারণ মনে করো, এখন যদি ধরো আমরা কেউ ইউক্রেন ওয়ার নিয়ে কাজ করতে চাই, প্রত্যেক দিনই সেটা পাল্টে যাচ্ছে। কি হতে চলেছে আমরা জানি না, কি ধরনের আউটকাম হবে আমরা জানি না। অ্যান্ড উই আর ভেরি মাচ ইনফ্লুয়েন্সড বাই, ইউনো, ইনফ্লুয়েন্সটা শুধুমাত্র বাইরে থেকে আসে না, আমাদের নিজেদের কনভিকশনও আছে। যে আমরা রাশিয়াকে কিভাবে কি চোখে দেখি, ইউক্রেনকে কি চোখে দেখি, পুটিনকে কি চোখে দেখি, জেলেনস্কিকে কি চোখে দেখি, আমেরিকান পলিসিকে কি চোখে দেখি, ইন্ডিয়ান পলিসিকে, ইউনো। সো অ্যান্ড দিস থিংস মাইট চেঞ্জ। তুমি এখান থেকে কোনো কিছু যদি বার করতে চাও জিও পলিটিক্স থেকে, আর জিও পলিটিক্স অ্যাকচুয়ালি, সত্যি কথা বলতে কি, জিও পলিটিক্স ইনফ্যাক্ট ডিলস উইথ imagined geography, and that is in a particular article I wrote that imagined geographies and imposed identities. ওখানেও ন্যারেটিভের গল্পটাই খুব বড় হয়ে দাঁড়ায়। জিও পলিটিক্সের যে মধ্যে যে জিও ব্যাপারটা আছে না, জিও পলিটিক্স ইজ নট সিম্পল ইন্টারন্যাশনাল পলিটিক্স। জিও পলিটিক্স হ্যাজ এ স্পেসিফিক কনোটেশন। ওই জিও ব্যাপারটা বিকামস ভেরি ইম্পর্টেন্ট, অ্যান্ড হাউ ইউ ডিফাইন দিস জিও, দ্যাট ইজ the earth, the space, that particular region, and you say, there are various unique, aspects in a geographical region. For example, if you talk about, let's say, South Asia, talk about Southeast Asia, and even in Southeast Asia, you take of India and you talk about unity in diversity. And how can you consider South Asia as a single geopolitical unit? All right, there are problems in pursuing this kind of research. So what I would say, that when you are trying to kind of observe and pin down, তার মধ্যে যেটা পাল্টে যাচ্ছে বা এই ধরনের কথা বলছো তুমি, সেই জন্য টাইম পিরিয়ডটা নেওয়া খুব জরুরি। থিসিস করার ক্ষেত্রে দুটো জিনিস মাথায় রাখার আছে। একটা হচ্ছে যে মানে এত পুরনো একটা বিষয় নিয়ে তুমি কাজ করো না যেটা নিয়ে লোকে পড়তেই ইন্টারেস্টেড হবে না। মানে অর্ডিনারিলি যে কোনো কাজেরই একটা মূল্য আছে যদি কাজটা ভালোভাবে করা যায়। কিন্তু সাপোজ কেউ যদি আমাকে এসে বলে, স্যার নন অ্যালাইনমেন্ট নিয়ে কাজ করবো, মানে হাউ ওয়াজ নন অ্যালাইনমেন্ট, নেহেরু কি করে বা টিটো নাসের এরা কি করেছিল, জেনারেলি পিপল উইল নট বি ইন্টারেস্টেড। তার কারণ হচ্ছে প্রচুর লেখা হয়েছে, প্রচুর ধরনের ভিউজ আছে এর উপরে, কনফ্লিক্টিং ভিউজ আছে, কিন্তু ওটা নিয়ে আর কাজ করার কিছু নেই। খুবই আর্কাইভাল, পুরোনো টাইপের। তার মানে কি পুরোনো জিনিস নিয়ে কাজ হবে না? হবে, বাট দেয়ার কুড বি ইন্টারেস্টিং অ্যাসপেক্টস দ্যাট ওয়ান ক্যান থিঙ্ক অফ। আবার ভবিষ্যতের ব্যাপারগুলো নিয়ে বা যেগুলো একেবারে রিসেন্ট বা কন্টিনিউইং, সেটা নিয়ে কাজ করাও খুব মুশকিল। প্রথম কথা হচ্ছে যে সেটার উপর এত ডেটা থাকবে যে কোন ডেটাটা ইম্পর্টেন্ট কোন ডেটাটা নয় সেটাই ধরতে পারবে না। আর প্রত্যেকদিন যেটা বলছো, প্রত্যেকদিন ব্যাপারটা চেঞ্জ করে যেতে থাকবে। সেই জন্যে the time period becomes important. For example, you talk about, তোমার টপিকটা কি বললে, জিওপলিটিক্স?
ফর এন এক্সাম্পল, যদি আমি এখন সৌদি ইরানের রাইভেলরি নিয়ে কিছু একটা চিন্তা ভাবনা করি, কিন্তু আবার রিসেন্ট টাইমে দেখা যাচ্ছে তাদের মধ্যে একটা বন্ধুত্বপূর্ণ সম্পর্ক হয়ে যাচ্ছে।
হ্যাঁ, তো সেটাই তো হচ্ছে সমস্যা। তুমি যখন রিসার্চটা করবে তখন তুমি একরকম লিখলে আর সেটা পাল্টে গেল, সেটা করে তো লাভ নেই। সেটা নিয়ে তুমি খবরের কাগজে লিখতে পারো, বুঝতে পারছো, জার্নাল আর্টিকেল লিখতে পারো, কিন্তু এবং সেগুলো মানে কন্টেম্পোরারি আপডেটেড ভার্সন থাকে। তুমি আজকের জার্নাল আর্টিকেলে একটা লেখা পড়লে, 6 মাস বাদে অন্য একটা লেখা পড়লে দেখবে তার মধ্যে কতটা তফাৎ আছে, কারণ তার মধ্যে নানান জিনিস ঘটে গেছে, নিউ টাইপ অফ পারহ্যাপস ইনসাইট, পারহ্যাপস ইন্টারপ্রিটেশন পাওয়া গেছে। সেই জন্য টাইম পিরিয়ড নেওয়াটা জরুরি হয়ে যায়। সাপোজ তুমি ইরান সৌদি আরবের কাজ নিয়ে করতে চাও, সিলেক্ট এ পার্টিকুলার পিরিয়ড। ওকে, যে আমি 2010 থেকে 2020 অবধি করবো, ইটস জাস্ট আর্গুমেন্ট সে। আমি কেন 2010 থেকে 2020 হবে সেটা আলাদা ইস্যু, কিন্তু একটা পার্টিকুলার টাইম পিরিয়ড তুমি বেছে নিচ্ছ। ইনটুইটিভলি তোমাকে ঠিক করতে হবে ওই যে পার্টিকুলার টাইম পিরিয়ডটা তুমি বেছে নিচ্ছ, ইটস নট লাইক এ ডেসক্রিপশন অফ ইরান এই করলো, সৌদি আরবিয়া ওই করলো। A thesis cannot be a, some kind of travel diary. এর প্রধানমন্ত্রী এদেশে এলো, ওর প্রেসিডেন্ট ওদিকে গেল, নো, it won't be a kind of good work. যেটা হবে, তুমি ধরলে 2010 থেকে 2020 এর মধ্যে সৌদি আরব আর ইরানের মধ্যে যে সম্পর্কটা, তার মেইন ক্রাস্ক গুলো কি কি হয়েছে। ওকে, and then if you are working now in 2023 and after 3 years you would submit it, তুমি তার মধ্যে জানো যে কি হয়েছে, whether it actually corresponded to তোমার যে অবজারভেশনস গুলো ছিল, অথবা সেখান থেকে শিফট করে গেছে। তুমি একটা এপিলগ, উপসংহার গোছের জুড়ে দিতে পারো, কিন্তু ওই সমস্ত সমস্যা থেকে বাঁচার জন্য এসেনশিয়ালি ওই টাইম পিরিয়ডটা নেওয়া জরুরি, যে ওইখানে শেষ, তার বেশি আমি আর এগোচ্ছি না, পাল্টালেও আমার কিছু এসে যাচ্ছে না।
থ্যাংক ইউ স্যার।
আর কারো কিছু প্রশ্ন আছে?
Sir, I have a question.
মধুরিমা, হ্যাঁ বলো।
Sir, আমি এখনো কোথাও মানে as a PhD student or research scholar enroll হইনি. I'm just like preparing my research proposal till now, and my proposal is on the rising power of Bangladesh and Myanmar in Bay of Bengal region. বাট স্যার আমি যখন এই মানে পুরো যখন এম্পিরিক্যাল ডেটাস वगैरह নিয়ে কাজ করছি, দ্যাটস নট আ ইস্যু, বাট যখন আমি থিওরি আউটলাইন করতে চাইছি একটা কনসেপচুয়াল ফ্রেমওয়ার্কের, আই এম ফেসিং দ্যাট মোস্ট অফ দ্য থিওরিজ অফ আয়ার, মানে নিওরিয়ালিজম থেকে শুরু করে ব্যালেন্স অফ পাওয়ার টু এভরিওয়্যার, আর টকিং অ্যাবাউট মেনলি দ্য গ্রেট পাওয়ার্স, and those who are talking about say for example middle powers or non-western theories, সেখানেও এই সাউথ এশিয়ার দেশগুলোকে নিয়ে সেভাবে ডিসকাশন করা মানে সেভাবে হয় না। তো যখন আমি এদেরকে অ্যাজ এ থিওরি কনসেপচুয়াল আনতে চাইছি না স্যার, মানে আই ওয়ান্টেড টু ইনক্লুড দেম অ্যাজ এ মিডল পাওয়ার, কিন্তু সেরকম কোনো কাজও হয়নি। তো এরকম টাইম মানে অ্যাজ এ রিসার্চার হোয়াট উই শুড ডু, যে যখন আমি একটা থিওরি কনসেপচুয়াল
Excuse me, sir. Excuse me, sir. Sir, actually, I am a non-Bengali, so I am unable to interpret in Bengali language. Could you please stick to English? Yeah.
Yes.
Thank you, sir.
Because questions were in Bengali, so that's why I responded in Bengali. It happens that
Yes,
way.
yes, sir. No issues. Yeah, thank you.
Okay.
Yeah.
What I was just mentioning, in my lecture, that it is not always important for the thesis to have a theoretical foundation. Okay, it is important for the researcher to actually declare his or her theoretical inclination. Okay, suppose you don't even in fact realize that you are a realist, then that inclination would be inside you. So you try to find out what kind of parameters you would apply when you interpret certain events. Okay, and that's why you require some kind of theoretical foundation. Now, when you talk about relations between two countries, If you think of realism, obviously realism is for the big powers, in simple terms. Realism actually, helps justify big power politics. They actually instigate or inspire the middle ranking powers, and the small powers are actually victims of realism, basically. If you think in those theoretical terms. Now, there could be obviously disagreements on that particular point, but the basic idea is realism is mostly concerned with power struggle, big power, accumulation of power, etc., etc. So, how do you think of these two countries, say, for example, Bangladesh or Myanmar? And you'd find that they, within their own limitations, while they would try to accumulate strength and power, but at the same time, their security challenges would be different from the security challenges of, say, USA or Russia or China. So naturally, what you'd like to say here that you don't require a theoretical foundation in that sense, that you have to have realist foundation or liberal foundation, but your inclination must be declared. But here you can talk about two relations between